the negative externalities associated with pollution are one thing, but the negative externalities associated with unemployment, depression, the uncertainty associated with change being forced upon you by the authoritarian state that Sadiq Khan has imposed in London, these matter too. And Sadiq Khan, at every stage of the implementation of ULEZ, has exaggerated the impact of air pollution, he's exaggerated the impact of ULEZ on air pollution, and he's underplayed the consequences of this disastrous policy.
Hello and welcome to the IA YouTube channel. My name is Reem, Ibrahim and I'm a Communications Officer and Linda Whetstone Scholar here at the Institute of Economic Affairs. I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by our Research Assistant here at the IEA, Daniel Freeman, and our Energy Analyst at the IEA, Andy Mayer. Sadiq Khan this week has announced the implementation of the ultra-low emission zone. This effectively means that those that own cars that are not ULEZ exempt have to pay an extra £12.50 surcharge. This zone is now being expanded across London's suburbs. It's been a particularly politically contentious topic as a result of the Uxbridge and South Ruislip by-election, and it was also used in those various campaigns locally. So, Daniel, you yourself have written in support of the ULEZ scheme. Can you tell me a little bit about why negative externalities should be taxed?
Well, I think in the case of ULEZ, it's essentially a tax on dirty air. It's a well-established fact that older, particularly diesel cars that were produced before 2015 emit a lot of emissions like small particle matter and nitrogen oxide, which have a demonstrably bad effect on people's health and can lead to chronic lung disease and premature death. I think as free marketeers, we broadly ought to support measures that seek to internalise externalities through imposing taxes, rather than bans and ever more regulation. So I think this is a kind of step in the right direction.
So rather than banning those cars, those individuals have to then have an extra tax, so they're obviously punished through those kind of Pigouvian taxes. Andy, you hold a different perspective on this issue. What do you think?
Well, not entirely. So let's start where Daniel and I are probably going to agree. So he's laid out the groundwork on the economic theory of how you should deal with difficult environmental problems as a free marketeer. And generally, we agree that you should put a price on a pollutant if that pollutant has a particularly harmful effect, and try and find market mechanisms for encouraging people to then reduce the activities that cause that pollution. Where Daniel is entirely wrong and has completely misunderstood this issue is that ULEZ is not that at all. ULEZ fundamentally is just a tax, and it's just a tax principally on some of the poorest and most vulnerable people in society, not the unemployed, but the people who are living on the edge and the margin of employment and unemployment, particularly those who use vehicles, who are the ones who could be paying up to £3,000 a year for this tax because they're in that horrible position that they need to use the vehicle for work, but they can't afford to replace the vehicle with something newer and less polluting. So the negative externalities associated with pollution are one thing, but the negative externalities associated with unemployment, depression, the uncertainty associated with change being forced upon you by the authoritarian state that Sadiq Khan has imposed in London, these matter too. And Sadiq Khan, at every stage of the implementation of ULEZ, has exaggerated the impact of air pollution, he's exaggerated the impact of ULEZ on air pollution, and he's underplayed the consequences of this disastrous policy that is having political ramifications both for him, but also for the party that supported it, which was Labour, that's now looking a bit more ropey, and also in terms of the electoral fortunes of the Conservatives in London. So it's a misapplication of economic theory to a very bad policy, and one that needs to be substantially rethought.
Okay, so we've both set out both of those sides of the arguments here, and I think that the evidence with this particular policy is interesting. So, Dan, can you tell me a little bit about what the evidence actually is with regard to ULEZ? It's a tax on dirty air, as you've argued, But will that actually result in the consequences of those of dirty air being reduced, or us seeing cleaner air in London? What are the consequences of this kind of policy?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of discussion and controversy over the specific figures for how many premature deaths per year it's leading to. And, Sadiq Khan put out a figure of 4,000 extra premature deaths a year. This has been disputed to some degree, but the fundamental science behind it is not at all controversial. Emissions from older cars do have serious health consequences. And, okay, part of that is premature deaths, which is obviously bad for the people involved. But there are also a lot of other more sort of limited consequences. So people developing bronchitis, asthma, various types of lung disease, which might not mean that they die directly as a result of pollution, but it can mean that they're going to take more time off work, they're going to see the doctor more, and all of these rack up so that the costs of this affect a huge number of people, essentially everyone in London. So you do have some research from, say, King's College London did a study back in 2015 where they estimated that the overall economic cost of small particle matter and nitrogen oxide in London from human sources amounts to about £2.5 billion a year, which is pretty substantial. And yeah, of course, ULEZ is not going to eliminate all of this, but it is one measure that we can implement now and are implementing now that will start to move these figures down.
Interesting. Do you think that that's sort of the summary of the evidence? In conclusion, you think that the ULEZ scheme will actually, the evidence sort of shows ULEZ would reduce the amount of emissions in London, which of course would.
Yeah, I don't think anyone really disputes that it will reduce these emissions. Obviously, we need to wait for this scheme to have had the expansion to have been in place for a while for us to see actually how much it cuts. But I think there's not really any dispute that it will lead to a reduction.
Yeah, I mean, in that perspective, it's sort of consequentialist. Andy, do you want to tell me?
So much wrong there. Okay, so let's unpick this from basics. So the two main pollutants that we're talking about are nitrous oxide, NOx, and particulate matter, either at the level of 10 micrometers or at 2.5 micrometers, with 2.5 being the more dangerous consideration. And the first thing to note about both these things is, yes, they do have bad medical effects, and those are measurable. And those principally come about through the oxidating effects of those molecules and the way those molecules interact with other particles on the lungs. So they can do damage, and they can make conditions like asthma and bronchitis worse. That's all true. But if we go to the difference between medical fact and medical scenarios, we come to the problem with the 4,000 figure. So the 4,000 itself is extracted from a range of figures that came up with one for the UK in 2015 from the Committee on the Medical Effects of Air Pollution. And that came up with roughly about 40,000. And I think that was 29,000 associated with particulate matter, mostly 2.5, and 11,000 associated with NOx. That study in itself was based on a 2010 review of data by a different body, and the 2010 review in itself was based on an American study from 2002 that was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, based on data looking at American cities between 1982 and 1996. And that study came up with the rough assumption that the increase in mortality effect of air pollution was about 4 to 8%, which was averaged to 6% to give a simpler number. So it's a range, not a single number to start with. And it's not actually 4,000 deaths. It's modelled on the effect of lost life years.
Yeah,
which
70,000 life years lost.
340,000 was the summary from just the 29,000, so about 500,000 across the entire UK population was the figure used, which amounts to about 3 days, 4 days per person. And clearly it would not be 3 or 4 days per person because it would be concentrated on those most vulnerable, those with pre-existing comorbidities and lung conditions.
Like asthma, for example.
Or a predisposition like I have to getting that. I'm allergic to pretty much everything. So I spend most of the year fearing natural environment particulates in the form of pollen. And that does have an effect on my health, which I manage through antihistamines. But the point is that when you say something scary, like 4,000 dead a year from air pollution, you're doing it for political effect. And if the reality is that we're implementing this extremely expensive tax on the basis that we're trying to extend lives that are already now measured at about an average of 80 years over the course of a lifetime, by 3 days, it doesn't sound quite so impressive or worth doing that. And it's not even that. So we go back to your other point. Bringing in a tax like ULEZ will not eliminate 4,000. And Sadiq Khan won't say how many deaths it will eliminate. And where there has been thinking on this in his own report, which was about 200 pages, I believe the figure that the Daily Mail used was that you would reduce the number of deaths from lung cancer in London from 955 to 954 per year, which strikes me as a very poor justification for a scheme costing hundreds of millions of pounds and destroying the lives of poor working people.
So I guess the economic cost of this particular policy is interesting, but just focusing on the evidence around whether or not it will actually clean up air, and also whether or not it will add those additional days to people's lives. Do you think that the evidence is there for this kind of policy?
I think the issue with the anti-ULEZ people is they kind of want to have their cake and eat it on this point, is that they go on about how this is a devastating tax that is going to destroy hundreds of thousands of people's lives and livelihoods, but also it's not actually going to reduce emissions that much. It seems like you kind of want to be of the position that, oh yeah, it's going to have a massive impact on people and it's going to dramatically change their behaviour, leading them to shift away from the most polluting vehicles. But it's also not going to lead to less emissions.
Well, that isn't a contradiction. I mean, very few people who are on the average salary in London or the country more widely can afford to just find £3,000 a year more in their pocket, particularly not during a cost of living crisis with inflation running around 10%. And that's mostly impacting the basic goods.
And there's also, the economic impact of having to scrap your car if you are to do that. You spoke earlier about the types of individuals that are sort of on the cusp of unemployment. Potentially they are self-employed, those that are car-bound, those that are using their cars for work. Often they cannot afford to take off an extra day or two to scrap the car and buy a new one. And there's also the cost of what the subsidies that the government are going to be implementing to also pay for the.
And in the main, they wouldn't be able to buy a new car. New cars are exceptionally expensive, and electric new cars are even more expensive. What they would be buying is another second-hand car that was just on the other side of the line of the diesel or the petrol standards. And that car then would be hit when the ULEZ standards were inevitably increased, as they will be in 2025, when Euro 7 comes in across both petrol and diesel engines. So it's a temporary reprieve, and that scheme in itself, that it needs a scrappage scheme on top of it in order to try and address this systematic unfairness issue, suggests that it's not going to raise the money they thought it would, and instead it's going to create largely additional jobs and welfare in the used car market, which doesn't strike me as a market that needs government aid.
I think that's a particularly interesting point. Do you want to come back onto that point about the particular economic cost of this issue?
Yeah, well, I would say that we should be careful as free marketeers to sort of start from a this position that because the costs of the policy are concentrated onto certain people, and the benefits are distributed widely, we should be opposed to this. Like, you could say that I'm sure there are plenty of hard-working, enterprising builders.
But sorry, Daniel, that's not my point. My point is the benefits distributed widely are negligible. We're talking, as I said, about 3 days extra life per year, possibly, but not even that, because it doesn't have that impact.
This is 3 days of life per year, each year.
No,
each additional
that's across
year.
your entire life.
That wasn't my reading of the paper, but maybe I misunderstood it. But regardless, you still have significant health impacts, which cost the health service significant amounts of money. It leads to a reduction in productivity from people taking days off, which, according to King's College London, this is costing the London economy about £2.5 billion a year. So even if ULEZ leads to a reduction of say 5%, that's still a pretty substantial amount of money.
Well, there we go to the current controversy about ULEZ, which is that the mayor's own sources for evidence have been distorted in terms of that kind of impact. I mean, it's certainly true.
It's Imperial study rather than King's College,
sure,
which is independent and
sure.
Had no connection to Sadiq Khan. He was still MP for Tooting.
So wasn't the controversy around the city's funding of?
But the controversy is the specific additional impact that ULEZ has on reducing air pollution. Most of the reductions in NOx and particulate matter have already happened. There's been a massive collapse in those kind of emissions since the 1970s. I think about 90% of the collapse on NOx has been even since the 1990s, and that's got nothing to do with ULEZ. That's just rising standards and improving technology, which fundamentally are what drive lower pollution vehicles and lower pollution generally. Transport pollution in itself, I think, is something like 12 to 15% of the overall total of both of these particular pollutants in the country. Most of the additional comes from heavy industry, comes from wood-burning stoves in homes.
That's in the country as a whole, not in London.
Which is an urban area, I agree.
A significantly greater proportion comes from transport.
So if your solution then, sort of thinking about the way that we want to potentially tax negative externalities, and that's effectively your argument, if we don't do that, what would the solution then be to increasing dirty air?
So where I think Daniel does have a point about ULEZ-like schemes is currently we are raising about £50 billion a year for environmental taxes, and those are figures from the Office of Budget Responsibility. And that's not comprehensive. It doesn't include things like the North Sea in transport. So 75% energy taxes, 22% taxes on transport. And that mix is clearly wrong. That 3% on top is the pollution taxes, which is where ULEZ would fit in. And if the impact of pollutants is more severe than the impact of carbon dioxide on the atmosphere, for example, in terms of the overall effect, which is what you try to calculate when you're trying to work out what the level of tax should be to deal with an externality, then more should be shifted onto pollution taxes, but then it has to be shifted away from these other taxes, such that you're not overtaxing environmental harms and undertaxing other things. So one thing you could do to make ULEZ more acceptable would be to reduce fuel duty. Because it's already the case that we are overtaxing drivers through fuel duty. Fuel duty in itself, I think it's something like 28 to 30 billion pounds a year of revenue, more than accounts for all the spending that one would need to do in order to address Nicholas Stern's figure of 1 to 2% of GDP needs to be spent every year in order to tackle the effects of climate change. That's just one environmental problem. So if you're going down to the route of other things, then you need to ensure that the carbon tax is not too high and the pollutant taxes are only tackling the externality effects of those pollutants, which is hard to do, but to address some of these fairness questions.
I think that's particularly interesting, the alternative policies. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm wondering what your take would be on broadly because I agree we're going to have to transition away from relying so much on fuel duty, not least because more and more people are not driving petrol or diesel cars. So, there's going to be about...
So less taxes.
You've got a sort of 30 billion, as Andy say, you've got about a £30 billion gap that you're going to have to deal with. And my view is broadly we are going to have to move to a comprehensive system of road pricing. And what would be your view of a general shift in that direction and ULEZ sort of being part of that shift, as you can use the network of cameras to enforce a road pricing system in future?
It's a really interesting question. I mean, on the general economic principle, most free marketeers agree that road pricing is a superior solution in the long term. I think there is a subset of libertarian thinking that worries reasonably about the impacts on privacy. Do you trust the government with knowing where you are at all times when you are in a vehicle? Who gets to control that data? What happens to it? How can it be used? Is it simply there to fairly charge you for an externality, or is it going to be used for a host of other things? Because with the best will in the world, the civil service will go for it, the police will go for it, the Secret Service will want to use it. So there are reasonable objections to road pricing. I don't think the cameras are the solution, and I personally would not let local authorities set their own Pigouvian taxes, because you get this consistent problem of dual, triple taxation, all targeting the same group of people, all targeting drivers. But if you had a national scheme of transition that moved the country from fuel duty to road pricing, the Treasury has already looked at that, and they say that it should be broadly revenue neutral. I disagree. I think it should be based on what the actual environmental harm is, and that would mean lowering it overall at the moment, because those environmental taxes are already very high.
Could you actually just define what road pricing is, just for those?
So this is a system where people are, well, there are various different models, but this is a system where people are charged for either the number of miles that they drive, that's one option, or based on which roads they're using at which time. So you might be able to say charge more for certain roads in rush hour, and charge less at quieter times, charge more in the centre of London than you would in rural Shropshire. And in some ways, the congestion charge is kind of a very basic step in that direction.
I mean, a good analogy to the difference between proper road pricing and the congestion charge ULEZ type schemes is one between smart meters as implemented by the government and what they should have done. So smart meters as implemented through regulation have stuck these physical meters into every home, rather like we've stuck cameras around London. And that does sort of work. It's quite administrative and expensive. But what they should have done is waited until mobile technology had got to the level it is at now, and simply put a SIM card in every meter. And the road pricing scheme that will actually work, and the one that they will probably introduce eventually, is a SIM card in every car, or some other electronic device that allows you to monitor where the car is at any time. And there are wrinkles to that. What do you do about cars coming on the ferries, coming across the channel? But I guess we don't need yet another debate about things to do with the channel.
On the channel.
But again, you could have put a smart device in a visiting car. So it's not that hard with modern technology to do road pricing. The wrinkle is in how you do it. So you have variable pricing. How transparent is that pricing? How do you deal with distributional impacts and all these other things? But it's perfectly possible.
And I guess even with these sort of, fear of Big Brother and the cameras on the roads, that kind of a solution would sort of absolve that problem.
Well, no, it wouldn't solve it. You'd have to have regulation to prevent the government accessing the data for other purposes.
So that would be particularly interesting if the government weren't able to access that information. Although I suspect they would probably try to anyway.
They certainly would. I mean, we all know what would happen.
And we all know what would happen if the government had access to that kind of information.
Yeah, another suggestion I have seen on road pricing to account for the kind of privacy concerns is that you could have an option where every time you did an MOT, your the number of miles you had travelled would be paid at
which is very crude.
Paid
because if you're going down the road pricing route, you want to eliminate the congestion charge, you want to eliminate the ULEZ cameras. The pollution charge on your car would be based on its age and the standard applied to its engine and other factors, because clearly the current debate in pollution is that we've managed to get tailpipe emission pollutants down by about 90%, but they've remained static in terms of other particulate pollution coming off things like the brakes, the tyres, and the clutch. And that is the next area for the standards to try and tackle. And it's something that's going to be an increasing problem with electric vehicles because they're heavier. And that type of pollution is a lot higher when you are dealing with a heavier car versus a lighter ICE car.
Sorry, just coming back to something you said earlier, I was interested in your idea that introducing a road pricing scheme ought not to be revenue neutral. You ought to, save.
Government is not entitled to our money, Daniel.
Yeah,
Come on.
No, I'm not arguing with that. My issue is, and frankly, part of the reason I'm quite keen on ULEZ is that it seems to me that roads are systematically underpriced in London. You can see that by just how much time the average London commuter spends in traffic jams, which is significantly higher than road users in Paris, it's higher than road users in Berlin, it's higher even than road users in New York. Which indicates to me that this is an issue where people are overusing this resource that we have, as in our roads.
The particularly interesting point there, I guess, would be how would you measure the kind of pricing for those particular roads, depending on how much those people are using those roads.
Yeah.
So how do you measure it?
The issue is that every hour that someone spends in a traffic jam is, a very significant loss to human well-being from a personal level, but it's also reducing productivity.
So the future of cars is one where increasingly the driver makes fewer decisions. Self-drive cars are already possible, and the AI is only going to get better. And the AI in your vehicle in the future, in a world of road pricing, would direct you to the routes where you would spend less. And you might want to set it so that you spend more to get to places faster. That's your choice. But it is perfectly possible to incorporate all of these different type of taxes into one system, which ultimately is going to be more convenient for people and more popular than these rather scary camera-based systems.
I guess the difference between this particular road pricing system and ULEZ is that ULEZ is only applicable to cars that are sort of not they're all petrol diesel. So this road pricing would apply to every driver.
Yeah, ultimately it would have to in large part because it seems drivers are moving more and more towards electric vehicles, and so the whole system of funding both the construction of new roads, maintenance of new roads, and on top of this quite a bit of extra money for the Treasury is coming from fuel duty, which will be much less in the future.
One of the reasonable grievances that drivers should have is that the money the government raises from fuel duty already massively covers the road building programme.
Yes.
And ULEZ is a particularly egregious example of using drivers to pay for public transport while doing nothing to improve the roads. And I just want to be clear on this point, because where this came from originally was Sadiq Khan's promise to freeze the fares in London in his first election campaign. And that had a predictable impact on the income of TfL, which was then went off a cliff during the pandemic and has not fully recovered.
And they bankrupted about 3 times. They had to have the national government bail them out.
They had to have the national government bail them out, and new sources of revenue was one of the conditions of that bailout. And that is where ULEZ has come from. It wasn't brought in to save the lives of children. It was brought in to bail out a politician making a dishonest promise he couldn't keep.
I think it's particularly interesting in terms of, I guess, the politics behind ULEZ. Just the difference between the road pricing scheme that you both sort of argued for effectively, and ULEZ is that ULEZ is, as you've argued, a tax on dirty air. So it's looking at those consequences of that kind of emission. How would a road pricing scheme also sort of fix those negative externalities?
Well, you could vary the price that you had to pay, but both based on the type of road you're using and at what time you're using it. But you could also vary it based on the model of car you're using. So if you want to drive a really old, really inefficient car that emits loads of NOS or whatever, you can do that. You just have to pay more for it.
Okay.
And that's.
But a vintage car, you don't have to pay. I mean, there's a hilarious article about a tank.
Say,
You can drive a tank around outside the House of Parliament without paying ULEZ.
If it's over 40 years old, you can get an exemption. Yeah, but my issue is, I think that I do not think ULEZ is perfect. I don't think Sadiq Khan is a particularly good or even very honest politician. You'll be amazed to hear. And I think some of the evidence that has been used has been overblown. But I think the fundamental issue that we have is that there are economic and health impacts from pollution, especially in London. And also just roads in London are overused and undertaxed. And I think if one of the ways to get fewer cars on the road and more efficient journeys is to basically hammer the oldest, most polluting vehicles, I'm okay with that.
And I'll give you the last word on this.
Well, the best way of getting rid of older and polluting vehicles is to let the market work. The replacement rate in the fleet of about 40 million vehicles in the UK is about 45% a year. These older vehicles are going anyway, and they're going to go at a pace that means if we just left things alone, that the problem would solve itself. By imposing these schemes, you actually create a Cuba-like backlash where you'll end up with more of these older 40-year-old vehicles on the road to avoid the scheme. So it's a foolish proposition from that perspective. On the health question, I think the health impacts of destroying people's lives are unambiguously worse than the trivial benefits of making a marginal difference to pollutants that are falling anyway, and in the most cases are already at safe levels. We'd be better off looking at the ways in which technology can help deliver those last mile benefits, particularly on the non-tailpipe emissions. And finally, if we are going to go down this route, it should be something that is looked at nationally, not locally, because you can't trust local politicians to do things like this. They always use it to raise revenue. They don't do it for health reasons, and then they're not honest about it, which devalues public life for everybody.
Well, thank you both for this fantastic debate. Let us know what you think in the comments below. Is ULEZ an effective scheme? Is it going to work? Do you agree with Daniel or do you agree with Andy? Until next time, thank you very much.